every aspect of life, family, entrepreneurship, personal development, tech, and marketing using real, raw, and 100% no bullshit proven tactics. My name is Ivan Temelkov, and I'm your host. I hope you weren't expecting anyone else. And today I'm joined on the podcast by the lovely Charlotte Kemp. Welcome, Charlotte, to the show.
Ivan, thank you very much for having me here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Charlotte, I had reached out to you. I think it was from a newsletter that my podcast was featured on. I'm like reading this, and the word futurist like stood out to me. I was like, all right, I gotta have this woman on my podcast. I'm sure she can judge. But before we do that, I want to introduce you to the viewers, the listeners also, and let them know a little about your background. So Charlotte is a futurist alchemist, a futurist keynote speaker who works with organizations to co-create preferred futures, a member of the Association of Professional Futurists, as well as the president of the Professional Speakers Association of Southern Africa. Also the author of a number of books, including Futures Alchemist, which presents a narrative of how to use her map, compass, and guide model to navigate unknown futures. For research and insight, Charlotte hosts a podcast series called Futures Facets and interviews people around the world to gain an understanding of how we see the future from our points of view. You also have a signature talk, Become the Conscious Futurist Your Industry Needs Now, and you explore ways to intentionally create changes that will usher in our preferred future for our own industries. And you also serve on a number of association boards and steering communities, and you also work as an association futurist. Oh my God. So everything in your bio is like futurist. So I know there were several questions that I want to get your take on, but before we get into that, tell us a little bit about your story. You know, where you come from, where you've been, what you've seen. Let's paint the picture from childhood to modern day, so to speak.
Wow, that far back. Thank you. All right, so I live here in South Africa. It's absolutely beautiful. And my father was in financial services when I was still a child in school. So we moved around a lot. So I've lived in all the different parts of this beautiful country. And then I grew up and got married and moved to Gauteng, which is like the business hub, Johannesburg. And I started working in financial services myself. So I worked for banks and insurance companies and brokerages and financial firms. And with that experience and with what I was doing, I kind of fell into training the new staff members who joined this last company that I was with. So a new person would come along, I would teach them whatever I knew, the systems, the background and everything. And then as the company expanded, they made me into the training department. So I started training officially training everyone. Mm-hmm. And then took a few years off to have my two children, beautiful girls, and the oldest one is now following third generation into financial services and studying that in university. And then when I started wanting to come back to work, I bought a franchise business. It was an investment. I was living still in Gauteng. My parents were down on the East Coast, and my parents were going to run the business. And my mother had a series of heart attacks in the month that we were opening this retail service center thing in a busy shopping mall. And that really threw us. So this is a family business. My mom is going to run it. She's fighting for her life. My father had to resign from his job to run my business. I'm living up in another province, just got divorced. So a lot of serious trauma.
Yeah.
So the family all got together. We worked in the business together for a little bit, but then eventually I lost it. And I lost everything when I lost this business. Retrenched my own parents, lost all my money in my investments, in my car, in my house. And so I wrote a book at the time called I'm Not Afraid of the F Word. And I wasn't being too coy, although I was a little anxious about the title, but the F wasn't It wasn't the F word we would use
Sure.
today in this conversation, but it was actually failure. And the problem is in South Africa, we do not like talking about failure. If you fail at business, the banks do not want to talk to you. Nobody wants to make eye contact with you.
Oh, wow.
And I wanted to say this is the taboo we've got to get over because too many of us are experiencing it. Anyway, a little bit of other things went along. I started trying to market this book that I'd written and this keynote that I'd written, prepared with it, but I've got no money left, obviously, because I've just lost everything. So I started using social media, online marketing, and this was about 15 years ago, and it was all quite new. So I was having to go online, find out what to do, research, talk to the few colleagues in this country that were working in this space, and I started marketing myself. And people started coming to me, not about my signature talk and my book, but to say, how did you just do that on Twitter? And so I started teaching them what I knew because I can't help myself. Sure. Anyway, after a decade of training on social media, online media, and specifically LinkedIn, which is my favorite, I thought I can't bring myself to teach people how to tweet better. I want to do something more substantial. And so I went back to university, back to start studying, and I discovered futures thinking or strategic foresight. And it felt like I'd come home. Everything that I've ever been interested in or concerned about or read as a curiosity just brought me back to futures thinking. And I love all the conversations we're having, all the amazing people that I get to speak to because of this mindset. And that's what I really love to share with people.
That's amazing. When you were sharing the word failure, which that was actually new to me because I thought it was F-U-C-K, fuck, right? But you said failure, and it's so interesting that you said that because I think in entrepreneurship specifically, I mean, if you don't embrace failure, entrepreneurship probably isn't the right fit for you because in the reality of things, you're going to fail more times than you're going to succeed because it's just unrealistic to know that every idea that comes to your head that's going to come to fruition. But what you said about that in South Africa, banks frown upon people with failures, it's like, don't you understand that small business fails? Any business fails.
Yeah.
If any business that posts a continuous win, there's something wrong there, honestly. Yeah. There's something wrong there because realistically it just cannot happen because there's just so many unforeseen things in business that you cannot predict. You cannot control so many things. The market could crash, right? And then, your business tanks. You lose massive amounts of revenue. When we saw that with COVID, it was completely unexpected. So okay, your business failed. Well, yeah, this pandemic happened. So, okay, well, you must be a failure, right? It's like, fuck no, it's a pandemic. It was unexpected. It was unpredictable. So it's so interesting you say that a lot of banks frown upon it when in fact small businesses are the backbone of any economy. So you need small business for job growth. Without small business, you've got no job growth. It's very hard, and especially in 2020 with the pandemic. I mean, we saw more and more corporations worldwide demise. Because they could not sustain, they could not grow, they could not continue to create jobs, but that also created massive opportunity for small business. And here's you saying that in South Africa, traditionally, banks frown upon people who fail. It's like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. So then you were talking about the futuristic aspect of it, and we'll talk more about it here because I personally can relate a lot to that because I was one of those kids growing up, especially that was like, everybody else is doing something. I'm like, I'm going to do something different, because I just don't like that. It just doesn't sit with me. When everybody goes left, I go right, or everybody goes right, I go left. It's like always the polar opposite. And growing up, what's really interesting is a lot of people would tell me that I had developmental problems. I didn't take interest in the things, that I would end up nothing, basically, growing up as an adult, that I had no direction. I had no career. I dropped out of college because I learned more on the internet than what I learned in college. But you know what? That was a huge disappointment also because I would have been the first to graduate in my entire family. So talk about mom and dad were like, really? Why didn't you graduate from college? It's like, well, sorry, mom and dad. I had different goals, different direction. And here's you talking about how when you found futurism, you're like, oh my God, I'm at home. You felt like you said, after you lost everything, right? I mean, the divorce, the money, the business, all of that. I mean, most people fold, right? In that situation, they just, let's cover my losses, so to speak, and figure out how to move on. And you instead embraced that failure. You embraced it from what it sounds like. You wrote the book, right? And then you realized that was actually probably one of the biggest learning experiences, right? From what had happened. So I'm just curious to know, and before we go into some of the stuff that I want to chat with you about, like, what was going through your mind? So after all of this happened, divorce, lost money, all this, like, what was going? Can you go back and like, what was going through your head at the time? Is what I'm curious about.
Yeah. Ivan, that's why I wrote the book right in the middle of losing everything. I just discovered the Professional Speakers Association at about the same time. Suddenly realized that not only could I possibly one day have a career as a trainer, but there's this whole world of which I didn't even know existed at the time. So one of the first things I heard in that world was you have to have a book to kind of get a reputation, but you can't have a book until you've got a story to tell. So here I am losing my business, talking to lawyers, talking to landlords, having the sheriff knock at my door and, serve me papers. And I thought I should write about this, but I don't want to write about it later when I've recovered. I want to write right now in the middle. So I set up a blog on my website, and I would wake up with my mind and my stomach churning at about 3:30 in the morning. I don't know what it was about 3:30, but I woke up and I blogged every single day for 50 days. It was just about 2 months. And so the subtitle of that book is 50 Lessons Learned on the Way to Business Failure. And what I did was I tackled the mistakes that I'd made, the positive things that I'd learned, the painful things, that I would never want to do again. And I wrote it raw right while I was experiencing that. And I know it touched people because I've had people buy that book and change their business decisions because of what I've written. I've had people phone me and say, when you wrote that piece, were you crying? Because I'm crying every time I read it. So it really was. And it's such a little difficult for me to go back and look at it because, the emotion really is there. But through that, I knew that I was experiencing something that was terrible, that I would never wish on anybody. But there has to be something past that. And when I look at what I've done now with my life, what my husband and I have done in designing a lifestyle, okay, I could never have done this if I took a conventional path. If I hadn't lost my business, if it had succeeded, I would be happy and maybe have 2 or 3 branches and be chugging along. But I've now got an absolutely phenomenal life because I embraced everything that I learned in that failure. And still, you wouldn't wish it on somebody, but if you're going to go through something bad, then make sure you squeeze all the goodness out of it.
There's so much, there's such a powerful message in what you just shared. And one thing, it's so ironic actually, because this morning on one of the other episodes, I talked about living in the present. And I talked about how important that is. So when you said you woke up at 3:30 in the morning, you just kind of like the spontaneity almost was like, okay, I'm going to blog. I think it was a way for you to alleviate the tension and the stress that you had developed inside, and that was your way of choosing to release it, right? And you decided to blog about it, but even more so, you blogged about it because you knew. It's like the back of your brain almost knew that, like, I'm going to reflect back on this, and I'm going to see all these lessons that I learned day by day. What was going through my mind? And that is so powerful because there's one thing that I personally have learned is that if you want to grow and scale, not just as a person, but as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, is that you need to become more documentative. and document everything. I mean, most people are like, why do I need to document this experience? Well, because it's going to help you fucking grow. You're going to look back at it and you're going to say, because at the time being, right, the first time you blogged, probably your instant reaction was like, oh my God, like you're so worried about sheriff's banging on my door. I'm going to lose my property. I don't have any money, right? But the flip side of your brain was like, I'm going to come back to this and I want to see the lesson that came from this. And I think that first time you blogged, it sounds like you were exercising self-control. And that's very powerful. Honestly, that is so powerful because I think you know this, being in the space for so long, entrepreneurs specifically, tend to rush a lot. I think most entrepreneurs feel like, I got this great, amazing idea. My business is the best thing. I'm going to skyrocket. I'm going to be the next Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos. It's like, nah, you probably won't be. Sorry. It's just not realistic, So to control specifically your emotions, I think you were really capable of controlling those emotions. But then you became repetitive with that behavior. That's even more powerful, is doing it day in and day out, day in and day out. So you were basically extracting all of your emotions, all of your feelings as you were going through these challenges and documenting it. And then you wrote that book on the 50 lessons that you learned. That is so powerful, And I bet you after you wrote that book, you look back and like, wow, I learned so much in this, right? Like you almost like you felt probably that gratification, not instant gratification, but gratification that you learned so much. It helped to progress and evolve as a person. It probably changed your approach entirely, right? Just the way you looked at things. And you also said something that what I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't realize is that entrepreneurship is 100% unconventional. It is not conventional. It is not meant to be. And if you think entrepreneurship is conventional, then that's one main reason why you shouldn't get into it. And I think conventional is like steady paycheck. Well, that's probably not going to happen. Steady cash flow, probably not going to happen for a while. A steady customer base, probably not going to happen for a while. Failure, oh yeah, that's going to happen a lot of times. And you got to learn how to embrace that. How to embrace those failures, how not to let those failures affect you and move on, because that's how you were able to write that book. Because you kept moving on. You recognize, okay, there's a lesson today that I learned. I'm going to blog about it. I'm going to document it. I'm going to move on to the next day, and the next day, and the next day. So that is so powerful. I want to segue into some of the questions here because these are amazing questions that you have put on here that I can so much resonate with. And the first one is, how can people co-create a different future from the one that we are blindly marching into? What are your thoughts on that?
All right. So as a futurist, obviously, I've studied, I'm a member of the Association of Professional Futurists. It's not a term that is very popular that a lot of people are exposed to. So we tend to think it's for someone else. Somebody else is a futurist. But my argument is that we are all futurists. And especially if we're entrepreneurial or we have our own business, but we're all natural futurists because we're thinking about what comes next. We're thinking about the end of the year, where can we go on holiday or not? What is it going to look like with COVID? We're thinking about our children and our children's education. Your parents are thinking about your education. So we have these thoughts about the future. We prepare, but we can be better futurists and more intentional if we start talking about it and thinking about it. And then when you become an intentional futurist, then you get to say, especially as entrepreneurs do, that what do I want this to look like? What do I want my business to look like, my lifestyle to look like? And we have to break that inherited perception of this is what a successful life looks like. You get a degree or a qualification and a nice job in a nice corporate, and you put money away for retirement, and you have a nice family, and that's conventional and that's success. And we're going, no, it's not. And maybe I want to do something different. And that is, when we start to do that, it's a very challenging time, and it's a really great space for entrepreneurs, because we can then create a business around our lifestyle, or we can service the kinds of people who want to have lifestyles that are unconventional. We can find niches in different markets that just didn't exist when we were aiming for, conventional things. And that's when we start to say, what do we prefer our future to look like, and how are we going to create that? But it has to be quite an intentional exercise, and I think it's a little bit of philosophy, and most people don't like to play around with philosophy. It's a bit of a scary area. If you ask too many questions, then we're going to have a midlife crisis and grow our hair and buy an expensive sports car. It doesn't need to be like that. We should be asking these philosophical questions to design the life worth living.
Yeah. There's two things you mentioned. That is absolutely spot on. And you talked about, as part of that, co-creating that new future and not walking into one that we're blindly steered into. It's so fascinating because, like, let's take my life, for example. I'm an Eastern European. So, like, my parents were like, go to college, get that degree, get that paper, get that job, right? And I think that me being a futurist and a disruptor, I chose a different path, clearly. But I think in part, at least for probably the first, I would say probably through my 20s, my early 20s, mid 20s, late 20s, I had sort of a scarcity mindset, because it came from, okay, I'm walking an unconventional route, which is what a futurist does, but I have a scarcity mindset because I was traditionally led into believing that conventional path is what I need to take. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I know people who are far more in debt because they've taken on more schooling, and they don't even make a fraction of the income that they had anticipated. And here's me scaling a business 6, almost 7 figures, and it's like I did this with, like, going to the school of hard knocks. Yeah. That was literally the essence of it. Because when I was 14 years old, I understood that the internet was the next best thing to sliced bread, literally. And instead of, doing my homework and what everybody else was doing, I was on the internet trying to figure out, the chat rooms and this and that and coding and programming and all that, MySpace, all this stuff, right? But back then, like you said, it was unconventional. And actually, a very prime example now, is the rise of social video and podcasts and video marketing, is this that talking about disruptive is, in fact, just recently, we started streaming this podcast in live video, because I was like, you know what, like, that's the way we got to go. I mean, audio podcast is great, but live video is like, because let's face it, like they say, a message is worth 1,000 words, I think it was, or video is worth 1,000,000. It just creates a better impression. It's more realistic and personable, right? So to your point, but that's just it. I think as a society, we, even to this day, are being led to believe that a traditional, conventional path in life, in business, in family, is what we need to walk and live. And anytime you are, disruptor, futurist, unconventional, guess what? You're frowned upon, right? Because you're not walking with the rest of the herd, so to speak. And that creates some fear, right? And I think one of the biggest things for me personally that I have had to learn the hard way is how to build up self-confidence. Because nobody else is going to be confident in your approach. If you're not confident in your approach, if you don't believe in yourself, who else is going to? So as a futurist, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you got to be very self-confident, right? 100%.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you're following the conventional path, then there's a definition of what that looks like as successful. So you can rate yourself and see where you are on that scale. But if you're traveling a new path that has not been traveled before, then you have nothing really to compare yourself to. So you don't know if you're succeeding or not. So you really do have to rely on yourself. I'll give you a quick example. When I try and talk to people and really unpack everything that we can explore about the future, I give this example of a map and a compass and a guide. Mm-hmm. So I would be the guide taking them, through this journey, but it's a transferable skill. So I want them to be the guide to take their teams, their families through. Mm-hmm. The compass encompasses all of the models, business models, academic models, all the ways we're going to work things out. So it's really nice and robust. But the map is just something that my husband and I sat down and created. And every time I use it, I go, wow, I had no idea this map was inspired more than what we thought we were putting down on it. But what we have is this, like 1/3 of the way into the map is this moment in time. And then on the left-hand side of that, the kind of historical path, there's 2 towns. And the towns are very different in terms of how the map is laid out. One is got a wall around it with just one tiny gate. So everybody inside there is nice and safe and is very predictable. And if they come out, they're coming out of their safety and everything looks scary. And if they look towards the ocean, there's this big monster, there's a big octopus. And the other town is open and there's a stream flowing through it. There's a fireplace so people can sit around and share stories and learn from each other. But because it's open, they can see the changing seasons, they can see trends coming along. And it's helpful when we have these conversations for people to say, my family and I were more in that walled, village, in that town that was all protected and safe and predictable. And that's why it's so scary for me coming out and doing something new. And while we are entrepreneurial and, people who are listening to that are, in that open space where they want to explore, they want to go down this unknown path towards an unknown, territory. Society still needs those people in that safe village, because there's a lot of things that need to be done there. And there's a lot of people who don't want to go on the adventure. And especially I think of, in terms of my family, my parents are happy and safe where they are. They do not want to go on a glorious adventure into an unknown wilderness. So we have to kind of respect and take care of those people who stay behind, while we go and explore. And if we can find the treasures of the future, we bring it back to them so that we can help to enhance the village that we come from. That's a story in a nutshell.
The 2 key takeaways out of that is comparison and comfort. Yeah. I think as you were talking about the model that you utilize, is I think even with the map, too many people try to compare themselves to everybody else. As a futurist, you don't compare yourself, because you are the leader. You are the innovator. You are the bulldozer that's bulldozing through, and you don't know what's on the other side. Nor do you care. You're just trying to get on the other side, right? And then the comfort is, you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of people in the world that like to live in comfort. And this goes beyond, and I'm a huge fan for psychology, a huge fan. I've had even several psychics on the show as well, and we've gotten deep into the psychology aspect. But as you were explaining it, I think there's a lot of people who do seek comfort, and they're okay with that. They're okay with that. The way I look at it is, okay, are you comfortable where you are? Is that where you want to be, right? Are you comfortable financially? Are you comfortable with your life? Are you comfortable with your family? Are you comfortable with what you have? If you're not, then you need to seek greener pastures. And that's what a futurist is. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but a futurist never stops. It's a continuous explorer, in essence. So that was really a key message, which kind of leads me to the next question I want to get your take on is, why do people feel like they need permission to do things?
Yeah, you need a really good psychologist to help unpack that one. But I find it frustrating. I read something the other day. I wish I could remember who said it. She says, it's not about who's going to let me. It's who's going to stop me. I thought that's kind of like the motto I'd like to take. I don't think that everyone I work with would be quite happy with that. But the idea is, if we have an idea in our minds and it's a good idea and it brings benefit to people, we should express it. We should explore that and do it. But so many people have this and they're like on the verge of something amazing, but they're waiting for someone to tell them it's okay. But everybody's got their own stuff that they're worried about, and they're not looking out for us to say, okay, you need permission, or you should go back and study some more, or you need a piece of paper before you can do this. We have to take what we've got and work with it. It's no good waiting for it, because something could come along like COVID, which totally grounds our plans, and then we have to try and be creative. And if we don't have that practice of trying something creative, something risky, something scary, without someone's permission, just trying it ourselves, if we don't build a talent and a strength for that, then when we really need to step up and do something amazing, we don't know how to, because we're still waiting for a boss or a teacher or somebody to say it's okay. So it's something we have to grow into and develop, and not everybody wants to do that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I can 100% relate to that. And that's why I wanted to ask this question, is because let's just say that my high school days are a giant blur because I was bullied all through high school. I was the kid that had the long hair, big glasses, pushed and kicked and called all kinds of names, sat by myself during lunch more times than I can count. And so that developed into low self-esteem and like zero confidence, zero self-belief. But I think in part because I was looking for validation, as you just pointed out. Like you said, most people, I think, in the traditional system, right, especially the education system, is when you get a degree, it's kind of like a validation, right? It's a stamp of approval that you've accomplished X, Y, Z. Well, someone like me who barely graduated high school and dropped out of college and have contributed to continued education curriculums suddenly goes like, what the fuck? How does that make sense? I don't have that paper, right? Yet I'm contributing to an emergent skill or skill sets that are in high demand. And they weren't even fully accredited because they're part of a continuing education program. So it's not of like an actual curriculum that's board certified and it goes through a list of bullshit and politics, to get the stamp of approval, right? So to your point is, I think a lot of people do look for that validation. Because they want to know that, like you said, it's okay. The mom and dad say that it's okay. And I struggle with that because, especially when I started my business, was like, will my parents approve of this? Like, well, what do they think of me being an entrepreneur instead of getting a 9-to-5 job? Well, let's see. I was broke as fuck in a 9-to-5, barely paid my bills after I got my paycheck. I was still broke after that, let alone now as a father to put any money away for my kids. A college fund, which you ask me, I think a college fund is a traditional thing. In reality, because I look at my kids and I'm like, both of them are probably going to be entrepreneurs. And I'm going to be fucking good at it too. Because they're in part taking from me and from my wife. Also, so to your point is, people don't need permission. The only person you need permission from is yourself. To say, yes, I can do it, and just go and fucking do it. Yeah. So the next question I have is, and this kind of relates a little bit, is why do people feel so disempowered about the future? I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to encourage people to have, some philosophical reflection. And I know I've mentioned this already, but I think we don't have time for it. And we don't have time in a busy lifestyle. We had COVID and we had lockdowns around the world, so people were sitting at home, so they thought they'd have more time, but they were just expanded to fill the free time. We don't take any time aside to contemplate, to have conversations, to dwell in something. I joined a mastermind with just a handful of friends. There's 5 of us. And we've been meeting for 3 years on a Wednesday morning from 8 to 9 for 4 years. And we've gone through the kind of the initial information that we were kind of sharing and talking about. But what we end up doing is actually giving each other space to have philosophical reflection on whatever our issues are. And because we have that, it just means when we when we take our product to market, when we take our training or our speaking to an audience, we know that we've already thought about it and already dwelt on it. So it's not something that is unformed or something that we're seeking validation for. So I know that the content that I bring to people is good, which means that when they say to me, "That was fantastic, you're brilliant, that's amazing," I say thank you, but I don't have to take all of that on board. I don't have to have their approval for my validation. But at the same time, if somebody comes into my training or into a session in a bad mood, or they disagree with me, or they don't like me, and they say something negative or unpleasant, I don't have to take that on board either. It's, whether it's a compliment or an insult, it's actually their problem, not mine, because I know what I know, because I've already spent time working on it. If I had not spent enough time working on myself and my knowledge and what I'm sharing, if I was just kind of skimming it and trying to present somebody else's content, then I would be that much more needy of somebody to approve me because I didn't own it. And I think, as an entrepreneur, we're obviously doing different kinds of work. We're offering different kinds of service. But if we really believe that what we're doing is valuable and worthwhile, we're not just making a widget to make money, but we're actually offering something of value, then we own that. And then we don't have to get the approval because it's ours.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. I think in part failure of success is what disempowers a lot of people, is because they look for so much instant gratification. And then to your point about the psychology, one of my most favorite quotes that I've been embracing for the last few years especially is by Tony Robbins, and it says that business is 90% psychology and 10% execution. So there's so much that goes into it. And I think this is why I personally have become such a huge proponent for personal development and mindset development, because, for instance, I've been a cyclist for 8 years. And like, for example, the first 2 years when I started cycling, it was all about, let's get lean and mean, lose a few pounds. But now, 8 years later, investment into a new bike is like, it's mind therapy. Yeah. For me, because that's like my holy place, so to speak, to go to, like, diffuse all the noise. And I realized that the more I cycle, it's almost like a good drug. It's like the more I cycle, the more my mind develops, the more, like, you have these empty slots sort of in your brain, and they start to fill with the right information. And suddenly, like, things just click, and you realize that business is really just about psychology. It's like perception, presentation, not scarcity mindset, not validation, not worrying for approval. And like you said, the haters, right? Someone might dislike you or something. I actually have learned over the years is that, and I've actually challenged myself purposely, is like, okay, acknowledge, but don't accept. Acknowledge, because let's face it, not everybody's going to like you. I mean, as a futurist, most people are not. Yeah. They're like, because you're going to think you're fucking crazy. They're going to look at you and like Elon Musk, most people think he's fucking crazy, but he's a self-made billionaire. So in the beginning, they thought he was crazy. He's every bit of a futurist, right? SpaceX, Tesla, the Boring Company, so on and so forth. PayPal is when PayPal was started, I was like, who's going to use PayPal? Well, it sold for $20 million back in the day, right? Yeah. Or $25 million or however, right, to eBay. So, like, to your point is that, no, you don't. You don't need permission. You shouldn't feel disempowered. You should feel whole within yourself, and then accept criticism, but delineate criticism from constructive criticism. Because the haters are all about criticism, right? Now, people who actually want to support and encourage you, they'll give you constructive criticism, which is the difference. And believe it or not, most people don't even know the difference between criticism and constructive criticism. Criticism is like, you suck. Constructive criticism is like, okay, you didn't do that too well, but here's how you could do it differently. And they give you input. So actually, your haters could actually turn into your biggest fans as long as they give you constructive criticism. But at the end of the day, like you said, you made a very good point. You don't need that for validation. The only person that needs that is you, to validate what you're doing. Because it takes time to bring things to fruition. As an entrepreneur, specifically, as a futurist, it takes time to bring things to fruition. I think that's what most entrepreneurs struggle with. And then, so the last question that is a really powerful and that I want to get your thoughts on too is, why do people who are intentional about creating their future so often look like the exception instead of the norm?
So many people just move blindly through the day and through the year, without any intention, and I think it is, it requires some kind of a disruption. So what we have is, you hit a birthday with a zero on the end, 30, 40, 50, 60, right. Or you get a divorce, or a global pandemic happens, and suddenly your plans are derailed. But the plans aren't these intentional things we've constructed. We've adopted, inherited some assumptions about what our future should look like, and all we try and do is say, I'm going to be successful like everyone else, but a little bit better. I'm going to, next year is going to be like last year, just 10% better. And we keep doing that without stopping to say, do I even want this? Is this even what I want?
Yeah.
As an example, my husband and I, he's entrepreneurial as well. He's lost some businesses. I've actually lost 2 businesses. And we got together and we said, we have all these speaking colleagues around the world a bunch of them who travel a lot. And there's always this kind of lifestyle thing about being by the beach. And we said, let's not wait until we're successful and we paid off everything and paid off the house to do that. Let's do it now. So we sold everything. We sold all of our property, all of our possessions, and we rented a furnished apartment right on the beach, just looking down over the waves. And we immediately had the lifestyle we wanted, but it was so completely contrary to what everybody else would expect us to do. But what that's allowed us to do is, and obviously this was, disrupted by COVID, but what we do is we spend 10 months in South Africa and we spend 2 months of the year in another part of the world. So we can really live somewhere else. So the last visit was 2 months in Menorca off the coast of Spain. The year before was 2 months in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. Just to spend 2 months in a city like that, meeting people, meeting colleagues and friends, just listening to the culture and the language around you. You can't do that if you lead, a conventional life. So we have to find ways to find something unconventional to follow. If that is, if we are that kind of person, there's going to be lots of people in our lives that who hear this and they panic. I had somebody who heard me talk about this once. She said, if I want to be a futurist, do I have to sell my house? I said, no, that's the path I've chosen. That's not yours. So we're going to have conventional people, but I think we really need to find those things that push us, that stretch us, so that we become aware of what we're capable of, because we're so much more capable of crafting, designing, and together with other people designing a future that is absolutely amazing. And I think most people don't give it the time and effort to actually really try that. It's a courageous step to do.
That is 100% spot on, and I think it also poses a really good point about how much being a futurist is actually very undefined, because like you said, the lady that questioned said, well, if I want to be a futurist, I have to sell my house. And it's like, no, you're making an assumption that you have to sell your house to become a futurist, right? So, and really a futurist is really someone who, is not living by a conventional route. That's just it. So conventional is, like with cryptocurrency, for instance. Most people think it's a fad, but crypto is the next wave. And he hasn't quite hit yet. He has hit, but he hasn't quite hit. And most people are like, well, no, I don't crypto. It's like until 5-10 years down the road when most banks are closing doors. And they're like, oh shit, I better get into cryptocurrency. So, but that's what a futurist does. That's what a disruptor does. It's kind of like 15 years ago when I was recording social videos, like most people are like, what the fuck are you doing? Putting yourself out on the web, you crazy dude, you know? And then nowadays, like, well, that's how I build relationships. That's why this podcast is in video, because it creates relatability, and relatability makes you the obvious choice to people because they can connect with you on an emotional level. But you see, like, most conventional people, like you said, just don't get that. They just don't, because I think they're looking for so much gratification behind everything. Because traditionally they were taught that way, right? It's like, I'm going to keep my money in the bank, because crypto is a fad. No, you need to go into crypto because guess what? The US dollar, the last time it crashed, it put us in an 80-year recession. And when it crashes next time, who's it going to affect? Middle class, people like you and me, for the most part, right? But people don't fathom that because they're not thinking that far ahead. They're not thinking that, and not even just crypto, but like life, right? Like you said, you sold everything, moved to an apartment, right? And suddenly you had the lifestyle that you had always dreamed of. Most people are probably going like, you're crazy, sold all your shit, right? What are you thinking? Going out on the limb. But you know what? That's how growth happens. Growth happens from discomfort. It's one of the hardest things that I think I've had to learn, because even though there's been like, I bought a dream car that I've wanted, right? I'm like, all right, don't get settled and get too comfortable now. Like, keep pushing, right? But even when I have all these things, like dream house next year, now I have a family, also and this and that, it's like, don't settle. Don't get comfortable. And I think that's the differentiation between someone a futurist, who's walking an unconventional path, and someone who lives in the norm, and they accept the norm because that's how they choose to live their lives. And this is all true about entrepreneurship and life and in business in general, because if you want to live the norm, entrepreneurship is probably not for you. I can tell you that right now. And if you want to live in comfort, entrepreneurship is not for you either. And you're probably not going to be a futurist either, because you already have it implanted in your mind of what you want to do, because you've been force-fed that, for growing up, your family, your friends, colleagues, people on social media specifically. And we'll see a lot of that, right? Every day, all over social media. Like, people are living a certain lifestyle, and they think that everybody else should live that lifestyle. It's like, well, just because you live a certain way doesn't mean that everybody else is going to live a certain way. So being a disruptor, being an innovator, being a futurist, it's all about making your own choices, right? Is what do you want, right? What does Charlotte want, right? What's going to make you happy? What do you feel like your definition of success is? Because I think in entrepreneurship, too many people say, well, success is money, right? Debt free, right? Like you said, most people wait to pay everything off and retire, which, let's face it, in this rate is what, 60, 70, 80 years old? Yeah. Maybe, to go and live in a fully furnished apartment on the beach, to be debt free, and you were like, nah, we're going to do the polar opposite. We're going to sell everything, and we're just going to go. Guess what? You're living that life because you were intentional about it.
Absolutely.
So, look, Charlotte, I absolutely love this discussion so much in it that, and again, being a huge fan of psychology, I think you unpacked so much of it. You've done a lot of it yourself with everything you've done in your life, in business, and that speaks great lengths, because that shows proof of concept that you weren't just intentional, but you actually executed on these things, which is like the next step of this. So before we wrap up this episode, which I absolutely loved, throw some handles, some websites, email addresses, whatever you can think of, that people can, reach out and connect with you.
Lovely, thank you. LinkedIn is good. Charlotte Kemp on LinkedIn. You can find me there quite easily. I'm called the Futures Alchemist. And I have a website. It's charlottekemp.co.za. And the ZA is for South Africa. And that's quite important, the suffix there of co.za. Because if you do charlottekemp.com, you're going to find a completely different Charlotte Kemp, and I'm not responsible at all for that. Please don't open that site working hours in front of your boss.
That's a really, really. Let's face it. I mean, the internet is a crowded space. I mean,
Yeah.
so I appreciate you sharing that, Charlotte. Thank you so much. I absolutely, absolutely love this discussion. You brought so much value, and I know listeners and viewers, are going to absolutely get all of that as well. So thank you so much again. Congratulations on everything, your book, business, your life. So happy to see that you've gotten to where you want to be, and I'm sure you still got a ways to go. So excited for you, on what happens this year and beyond.
Great. Ivan, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation with